So welcome, 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 Aunnie. We so appreciate your remarkable leadership and consistent solidarity and your remarkable body of work. And as always at Setsi, we begin all things by giving thanks to the original stewards of the various lands around. We give thanks to all our ancestors, all those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We give thanks to all our elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. So Aunnie, can you please introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers and share a bit about your remarkable work?
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. So my name is Aunnie Patton, and I work in what I used to say is a very niche area, but has certainly grown around designing innovative financial structures that embed impact into structures, processes, and incentives. So my work has taken lots of different forms, which I'm sure we'll talk about over the past kind of 13 years in the impact space. But really the fundamental driving piece for me has been the way we allocate capital, the way we aggregate capital, pull it together, should be inclusive, it should be impact focused, and it should be driven by what the needs are actually on the ground where the impact is being created. So for me, that means working with wealth holders, with governments, with organizations, building resources for nonprofits and for social enterprises and others to be able to create the type of funding journey that actually works for them, as opposed to being pushed into this kind of very traditional private equity, venture capital, market rate driven environment. And so I try my best to highlight stories of people that are doing this work, do my own work around building out these structures. And then I do a lot of teaching and writing to be able to really encourage others to, what I always say is just be courageous, like, build things that we need as opposed to just things that can be built.
Incredible, and I couldn't agree more. We need people to build things that we need. There's so much being built, but the question is, do we need this, and who's it serving? So once again, I appreciate your leadership and your candor. So my next question: what's inspiring you right now? What has you curious, or what's keeping you up at night?
Oh, those are different things, Victor. What's keeping me up at night, I can tell you, is that we're currently building a house, and that is a whole level of stress. So I think what does actually keep me up at night is the climate emergency, as well as I think there's things that we're all thinking about this year. The most governments ever are going to elections and democratic elections, and there's real unease around the direction that a lot of countries are taking. There is, panic, justifiable panic around climate. And I think in many ways, these things drive the work that I do, the work that you do, in that our current financial system is not working for most people. And it's not working for the planet either. It's working for a very few number of people that are able to profit off of it. And so what inspires me is a couple of things. So one is the next generation. When I get to teach kind of, 22 to 27-year-olds, maybe even up to 30, they just do not accept the status quo. Like their type, I'm used to being the radical one, and then they're pushing me on my, radical ideas. And so I'm excited for them. I'm like inspired by them and their willingness to rethink ownership, rethink power dynamics, rethink, actually how we calculate financial return and look at risk. And I think that's amazing. But what keeps me up at night in the context of the inequality and the climate is it going to be enough fast enough? And I think that's the thing, like the urgency that we're seeing, that people's lives need to be better today, and the planet needs to be these systemic issues around the climate crisis need to be addressed today, not in 10 or 15 years.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for that. And I agree so much in terms of not as young people, but I think that young people are definitely always leading the way in terms of every revolutionary act. But the rethinking of ownership, the emergence of social acquisitions, calculating risk, especially right now, the press to make sure that pension funds, large institutional investors recognize they're the stewards of the wealth, the 99%. So what do beneficiaries look like in terms of how those assets are allocated in a way that actually serves? So once again, that reimagining risk, I think is really important. So I appreciate, once again, your candor and leadership. My next question, what challenges and barriers do you face in your work? And what are some of the approaches you and your colleagues are taking to overcome some of these challenges and barriers?
So I always joke, Victor, that one of the things I have chosen to do for many years is beat my head against walls, because either they crack or I get a concussion, or sometimes both. So, I mean, I think the thing is that this work is very much about both fighting status quo and convincing the people that hold the power and the wealth to essentially come along on this journey. And in some cases, give up power, give up wealth, I mean, and so not easy things to do. So I think, if I look back on, in many ways, the world is changing and has changed over the past kind of 13, 14 years that I've been doing this work. And, some of that, I cannot take credit for. There are just conversations we can have today that we couldn't have even 5 or 6 years ago, in big boardrooms, talking very seriously about climate, about inequality, about race, about gender, just discussions that were relegated to the smaller rooms. Until, a few years ago. And so I think some of those things, that makes my work easier. So I don't have to go in and convince people about why racial inequality is, a significant economic issue, as well as a justice issue. Like, people walk into the room having had experiences that lead them there. And so that's really effective. I think for me, walking in and so the things that have changed that have been great is people are asking how, not why. And I think that how, and so for me, I spend my time with organizations that are asking how, very seriously asking how. And that's something that I do very deliberately. I kind of no longer feel I need to play the role of going in and convincing people that they need to do things. So what I want to do, and the strategies that I and many people I work with do, is that, we build actionable, this is what you can do. And I think that type of, saying venture capital doesn't work, you can have a whole discussion about that and say, oh, this is why venture capital, can be extractive. It is focused on exponential growth from a racial and a gender perspective. It actually has a terrible track record and continues that. You can say all you want. You can spend hours talking about that. But the next question, right, is, well, what do we do instead? And so for me, my book, Adventure Finance, is essentially almost 400 pages on here's what we can do otherwise. Here are investment structures, here are different types of processes, here's how you think about different incentives. And so I think that's, for me, my work has very much been about developing alternatives, highlighting alternatives, showing how there are kind of options that exist, because you can get everyone in agreement, the system doesn't work, but unless you give them options to meaningfully take forward, you're not going to affect change.
Indeed. And for anyone that has not read Adventure Finance, please order it today. We'll make sure you put the link in the bio. It's an incredible text. Yeah, no, I appreciate you. We're about to make sure we amplify, and give you your flowers right now while you're here to smell them and feel the positive energy. So my next question, do you have a set of key priorities right now in your work that you'd like to amplify or share with our listeners and viewers?
Sure, yeah. I have, there's always a variety of things that I'm doing, but I do like to center on a couple of things kind of each year that I'm particular areas. So for instance, last year spent quite a lot of time around impact linked compensation. So thinking about how fund managers are compensated related to impact. And so we produced a big report on that with lots of resources. You can find that at impactlinked.co. And I think that for me was something that was, interesting, because I think it's useful. It's a little bit more tweaking versus radically changing the system. So I've moved back into my comfort space on the radically changing. This year I'm focused, as far as big project wise, on 2 key areas. So one is shared ownership. So looking at employee community ownership, and in some cases, trust. So looking at kind of environmental climate, but really looking at how do we think about wealth creation? Because it's something that, for me, for a long time, I have said, and, have now gotten in the past year and a bit to really kind of get my hands dirty, like working on some of these structures. But, we've done a good job in this space of going from talking about beneficiaries, whether it's poor or marginalized individuals, to really thinking about producers and consumers. So, actually building social enterprises and, other, like looking at things like microinsurance, like really seeing people as producers and consumers. But what we have not done well, and reflects in the way the economies work, is move people from producers and consumers to wealth creation. And there are fundamental legacies around colonialism, around racism, that from a gender and as race perspective have kept people from wealth creation. And we see this globally because it's in the best interest of, elite ruling classes to have people that are that do not own assets, to have the assets actually concentrated amongst a smaller group of people. And so, there are a few very tried and true tested ways to get people to wealth creation, and asset ownership is by far and away the one that we just see as from a data perspective. And so, one way to think about this is people owning assets around their homes. So finding ways, but that's only one way. Another way is around businesses. So, who owns businesses, and whether they're, entrepreneurs, small businesses, medium-sized businesses, even large businesses. So looking at that ownership. And there's a movement globally, but particularly in the US, that has been pushed by something that's called the Silver Tsunami, which is a bunch of baby boomers retiring and not having children to give those businesses to. And so they have to look at what happens to these businesses that they've spent, their lifetimes building. And these can be things like a hardware store, all the way up to a manufacturing plant, to, a large commercial farm. And so, the options historically have been private equity buyouts or selling to a competitor or a large multinational, all of which results in generally job loss, particularly in small communities. And so an option, a really good option, should be for a lot of these companies actually facilitating a sale to their employees. And thinking about then how do those employees then ongoing own this business, be able to use that ownership to be able to access other types of capital, et cetera. And so there's about 2.8 million businesses that need to be sold in the next 10 years. And a lot of the people working in these businesses are previously marginalized communities. In the United States, African Americans, Hispanics, that don't have levels of ownership that we see with Caucasians. So, that's an area that I've really been kind of pushing into, because there's a huge need to have affordable capital go into this space to help facilitate those transitions. And then another one, just quickly, is something called strategic litigation. So I think I have grown increasingly pessimistic about very large companies ever making meaningful change, particularly around climate. And I think that legal tools are, as one of the organizations I was speaking with the other day, is that this is the language that corporations speak. They understand legal risk. And so there's some funds popping up. There's work that's been done on the nonprofit side around, funding some of these kind of legal initiatives against large corporates, against governments, to really affect change, whether through new regulation or just companies actually adhering to traditional regulation. And I know it sounds a bit wonky, but we can keep innovating on the edges, but unless some of these really big companies and some of these governments that frankly are burying their heads in the sand start to make serious progress around climate, we are not going to see the changes we need in the time period we need them. So I think there's some real levers to pull around using litigation to be able to force that, or create an environment of risk where doing nothing is no longer a viable option.
That's incredible. I don't know when you sleep, but people tell me that often. I know that in terms of Silver Tsunami, it's so interesting because a lot of our work at Setsi is intertwined with supporting remarkable leaders like
Right.
Bill Young, Matthew Mendelson, John Schnell at Social Capital Partners and their work around ESOPs, employee ownership trusts, and so on and so forth, Employee Ownership Canada. And then when I think about the social acquisitions work that Just Like Family, our colleague Carl Leon is doing, it's also remarkable work, you know? So once again, I really appreciate you raising that up. I had a conversation, I think 2 days ago, my colleague Tara, the executive director of Social Traders based in Australia. And she was talking about how social enterprises right now are scaling to the points where it's over $800 million to move to 5.5 billion by 2030. So when you think about social innovation, social impact, and the fact that there's all these, boomers that are transitioning, and there's a need for succession planning. I think some of these tools that we've used, one since time immemorial, but more recently in the social innovation, social impact space, can now be deployed in a way that makes sense for people and planets. And last but not least, that strategic litigation piece, I think, is so poignant. In Canada, we've gone through some serious issues around asylum seekers and climate and so on and so forth. I'm thinking that some of these migrant funds that are emerging in the States, can we start really leaning in and seeing how they can actually leverage litigation as a way to force action? So once again, I think that's brilliant, and I appreciate you sharing all that with our colleagues. So my second last question, what is your ultimate goal, and what does success look like to you and your colleagues?
Oh, this is a really good question because I'm currently right now working on an initiative that is not public yet, but part of it is setting milestones essentially for the next 5 years for the initiative. And, so I've been asking myself that question, like, what does success look like? And I think, if I had looked back 10, 12, 13 years ago, whatever, I think I would have moved more money now. So I think I'm feeling the need, and this is something that I've been saying the past year or so, is that I'm trying to spend less time on small projects and more time on really large projects. And they can be really large projects that are made up of thousands of tiny projects, right? This is not saying I want to go far away from like community focused endeavors. It's just, I think, as you said, like the time is like now. We have, it used to be that, oh, there weren't enough assets to do this, so we can't, think about this. And so, I think for me, for instance, this employee ownership project that we've been working on, like the goal is to essentially put together and catalyze about $500 million worth of financing to start with. And that's, I think, the levels that we should be looking at now. And, $500 million of very impactful funding. Like the whole thing with impact investing is, yes, we're over $1 trillion, but the question is like, what impact are we really having? So for me, I think there's two things. One is more capital allocated in ways that are kind of incredibly unapologetically impact focused. And two, I really just want to take these alternative structures, processes, and incentives and make them just structures, processes, and incentives, not alternatives, like just actually options and very mainstream in the impact world. As the impact world grows, I would prefer that instead of defaulting to the traditional status quo, it starts to be people start to ask you, why aren't you using impact-linked compensation? Why haven't you done impact, linked financing? Why are you thinking about exiting to a corporation as opposed to looking at, community or buyout or an employee buyout? And so, I think similar to how ESG, well, not in the States, but in everywhere else in the world, has kind of gotten to that point where like large institutional fund managers, they don't ask a fund manager, oh, why are you using ESG? They ask them like, why aren't you? Or in cases in Europe, like, we're going to have our money leave you unless you can tell us how you're doing this. So, just having some of these things that right now are considered radical, they're considered alternative, they're considered innovative, like making them just commonplace, and you're choosing between different types of structures, different types of very impact focused ways of allocating capital, and that's what success would look like for my work, at least.
That's incredible, and I couldn't agree more. I feel like even if it's 1,000 little projects wrapped up in one ball, at least the impact is there. But definitely, I think it's like we have to seize the moment. And the fact that you were mentioning earlier in our conversation or this interview, that it's no longer a question of why, it's about how. I think we have to seize this time because everything works in cycles. You know what I mean? There's that pendulum that swings back and forth in terms of momentum. And I think momentum is definitely on the side of those that share similar values and sentiments of yourself and have the track record of impact. So once again, I appreciate your leadership and candor. And my last question to you, before we close out, do you have any closing thoughts or calls to action for our listeners and our viewers?
Of course. So I always have the same one. I feel like it's a little bit of a cop out, but my call to action has been the same for many years, which is I just always want to tell people to be courageous, because we need to build the things, as I said at the beginning, that we need, not what can be built. And I always tell, whether it's young people or executives or whatever it is, like, this requires courage. You're doing things that are against the status quo often. But if enough of us are asking the right questions of why do we do it this way? Why is venture capital the default risk capital option for all entrepreneurs? Why don't we consider employee ownership, alongside traditional ownership? Why do we think about power structures the way we think about power structures? I think just really asking those questions and trying to build, like trying to find alternative ways to do things, and then pushing forward even when those are hard. It's about having the courage to stand up for what should be how the world works, because we get to build that now. Like, that's what we're all doing in this space, in the places that we work and live. Just because something's always been done one way does not mean that's how it has to continue going. And so I think that's for me. It's just be courageous, and go disrupt stuff.
Ashe, 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 Madasi Pa. Thank you so much, Aunnie, for your leadership, your solidarity, your candor, and the remarkable authenticity that you bring to this work. Your innovation is remarkable and unparalleled in many ways. So once again, I just appreciate all that you do for so many. And as always at Setsi, we close this conversation, this interview, the way we began. It's by giving thanks to the original stewards of the various lands we're on. We give thanks to all our ancestors, all those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We give thanks to all our elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. Thank you so much, Aunnie. I appreciate you.
You're very, very welcome. It was a lovely conversation. I'm so glad I got to be a part of it.